Picture this: a cold morning on the Norman coast, 900 years after Christ walked the earth. The surf crashes against blood-soaked sand, while somewhere in the chaos of battle, a young Viking named Bjorn watches the impossible happen. His father, this grizzled warrior who'd survived 30 summers of raiding, who could split a shield with one swing, whose very name made Frankish mothers pull their children indoors, is losing. The old man's axe, that trusted weapon that had served him through countless battles, strikes the enemy's armor with a sound like a bell tolling. But instead of the familiar crack of splitting bone or the wet thud of severed flesh, there's just this hollow ring. The blade glances off the Frankish warrior's ring mail like water off a duck's back. The enemy's return stroke finds its mark, and Bjorn's father falls to the sand, his blood mixing with the salt spray. Now, you have to understand something about Viking culture. When your father dies in battle, you don't just mourn, you analyze. What went wrong? How could a weapon that had been the terror of monasteries from Ireland to Russia suddenly become as useful as a wooden spoon against butter? The answer was staring Bjorn in the face, literally armored in iron rings. The world was changing. The Franks, those agricultural people the Vikings had been raiding for generations, had learned to forge better armor. Ring mail was becoming common among warriors who could afford it. And suddenly the traditional Viking axe designed for splitting wood and unarmored flesh was meeting its match. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because Bjorn didn't just go home and become a farmer. He walked into the workshop of master smith Ulfbert. And yes, that's the same Ulfbert whose name would become synonymous with the finest weapons in medieval Europe. Think of him as the equivalent of a modern aerospace engineer, except instead of rockets, he was forging the technology that would reshape warfare. These Viking forges weren't just workshops, they were sacred spaces. Picture walking into Ulfbert's forge and you're hit immediately by the heat, the constant ringing of hammers on anvils that sounds like temple bells calling the faithful to prayer. Sparks fly through the smoky air like Odin's ravens carrying messages between worlds. The smiths themselves approached their craft with religious devotion. They would fast for 3 days before beginning work on an important weapon, eating nothing but bread and water, preparing their souls as carefully as they prepared their iron. Local women would bring silver offerings, placing them on small altars within the forge, praying for weapon luck to bless the blade being born. Every hammer blow was accompanied by whispered prayers to Wielded the smith, the legendary craftsman of the gods. This wasn't just metalworking, this was a fusion of practical engineering and divine calling that modern people struggle to comprehend. Under Ulfbert's guidance, Bjorn began learning the mysteries of iron and steel. Month after month, he worked the bellows until his arms ached, heated metal until his face was permanently flushed red, and yes, burned his fingers to the bone, learning exactly how hot was too hot. The learning process was brutal. Failed prototypes piled up like casualties of war. Each mistake cost precious iron, precious time, and often precious skin. But here's what makes this story remarkable. Bjorn wasn't just learning to copy existing designs. He was innovating, driven by the memory of his father's death and the knowledge that Viking warriors needed something new to survive in this changing world. The breakthrough came during one of those moments that seem almost too perfect to be true. But history is full of them. Bjorn was examining a broken axe head when he noticed something. The lower edge of the blade, where it had cracked and extended downward, had caught on his leather apron in a way that the original design never would have. That extending lower edge created a hook, a small projection that could catch shields, find gaps in armor, and multiply the striking power of each blow. Think about the physics for a moment. A traditional axe relies purely on the momentum of its blade, but add a hook to that blade, and suddenly you're not just chopping, you're pulling, catching, redirecting. You can hook an enemy's shield and yank it aside, exposing him for a killing blow. You can catch the edge of ring mail and tear it open. You can even hook a weapon and disarm your opponent. Bjorn's first bearded axe, because that's what this hooked design would come to be called, the beard being that distinctive lower projection, was blessed according to ancient traditions. Under the light of a full moon, he sprinkled wolf's blood on the blade while Ulfbert spoke the old words that bound steel and spirit together. The weapon that emerged from that ritual would change everything. The test came sooner than expected. Word of Bjorn's father's death had reached the wrong ears, and the very Frankish warrior who had killed the old Viking came looking for more glory. This time, though, he faced something entirely new. When their weapons met, the bearded axe performed exactly as Bjorn had envisioned. The hook caught the Frankish warrior's shield edge and wrenched it aside. The follow-through strike tore through his ringmail at a joint the armor couldn't protect. The man who had seemed invincible just months before fell to a weapon that represented everything the Vikings did best, taking existing technology and making it deadlier through pure, practical innovation. Word of this new weapon spread from fjord to fjord, faster than news of a rich monastery ripe for raiding. But this wasn't just about one young warrior getting revenge for his father's death. This was about an entire culture adapting to survive. And the weapon they created would reshape the known world in ways that Bjorn could never have imagined. Because you see, when Vikings discover something that makes them more effective at what they do best well, that's when things start getting really interesting for everyone else. Now, here's something you need to understand about Viking society. When one warrior discovers a tactical advantage, it doesn't stay secret for long. News of Bjorn's bearded axe spread through the Norse world like wildfire through dry grass. And we're talking about a culture where information travelled at the speed of longship, which, considering these vessels could cover 100 miles in a single day under favourable conditions, was pretty damn fast for the 9th century. Within 2 years of that first successful combat test, every jarl and king from the fjords of Norway to the settlements of Iceland was demanding smiths who could forge this revolutionary design. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't like modern military procurement where innovations take decades to filter down through bureaucracy. This was a warrior culture where your life literally depended on having the best possible weapons, and if your neighbor had something better than you did, you got it, or you died. The weapon's reputation was built on more than just stories, though. In the war camps of Denmark, something unprecedented was happening. Elite Huskarls, these were the professional warriors. The special forces of their day were actually changing their training regimens to accommodate the bearded axe's unique capabilities. Picture these training sessions. Heavily muscled men in leather and mail, practicing what they called the shield hook. One warrior would hold a traditional round shield, while his partner would demonstrate how the axe's beard could catch the shield's rim and yank it aside, exposing the defender for a killing blow. They developed the armor catch, a technique where the hook could grab a gap in ringmail and tear it wide open. Most devastatingly, they perfected the pull and strike combination, where the initial hook would drag an enemy off balance and the follow-up blow would finish him while he was vulnerable. This wasn't just learning new sword forms or practicing with a longer spear. This was fundamentally reimagining how personal combat worked. The bearded axe turned defense into attack in ways that no previous weapon had achieved. But the real proving ground came in 885 Anno Domini, during what historians call the Great Siege of Paris. Now, Paris wasn't the massive city we know today. We're talking about a fortified island in the Seine River, defended by maybe 600 Frankish warriors against a Viking army that numbered in the thousands. The siege lasted almost a year, and it became the laboratory where Viking warriors perfected their bearded axe techniques under actual combat conditions. The chronicles from that siege, written by terrified Frankish monks who witnessed the assault, describe scenes that sound almost like science fiction to modern ears. Viking warriors scaling stone walls using their bearded axes as climbing tools, the hooks catching on the battlements and providing purchase for the ascent. Gate defenders found their traditional tactics useless when Viking axes could hook the gate bars and tear them apart from the outside. The Frankish cavalry, which had been so effective against traditional Viking weapons, discovered that mounted warriors were particularly vulnerable to weapons that could catch bridles, drag riders from their horses, and then finish them on the ground. Meanwhile, on the seas where Vikings had always been supreme, the bearded axe was revolutionizing naval combat. Norwegian raiders developed shipboard techniques that turned their vessels into floating weapon platforms. The axe's beard could catch enemy rigging and tear it down, effectively disabling an opponent's ability to maneuver. Enemy sailors found themselves being pulled overboard by hooks that caught their clothing or equipment. Traditional naval boarding tactics, which relied on getting close enough for sword work, became obsolete when Vikings could reach out with their hooked blades and drag opponents within killing range. The weapon's influence spread along the same routes that Viking traders and raiders followed. Swedish Vikings carried the design down the great Russian rivers, the Volga, the Dnieper, all the way to Constantinople itself. Byzantine chroniclers, these sophisticated urban scholars who thought they'd seen every type of barbarian weapon imaginable, wrote with what can only be described as trembling hands about the devil's axes of the Varangian Guard. The Varangians, for those who don't know, were essentially Viking mercenaries in service to the Byzantine emperor. They were the elite troops, the ones who stood between the emperor and anyone who wanted him dead. And when they adopted the bearded axe as their signature weapon, the entire Eastern Roman Empire took notice. But here's where the story takes an interesting economic turn. The bearded axe wasn't just changing warfare, it was transforming Viking society itself. A good bearded axe cost significantly less to produce than a sword, but proved far more versatile in actual combat. This meant that warriors who could never have afforded a quality sword could now carry a weapon that was, in many situations, superior. This democratization of military technology led to the rise of specialized production centers. Hedeby, in what we now call Denmark, became famous throughout Northern Europe for its axe smiths. Birka, in Sweden, developed its own distinct style. Master smiths in these towns grew wealthy as princes, their workshops becoming pilgrimage sites for warriors seeking the perfect weapon. The social implications were enormous. When more men could afford effective weapons, more men could participate in raiding expeditions. When more men could raid successfully, more wealth flowed back into Scandinavian communities. This wasn't just military innovation, this was economic revolution, disguised as weapons development. Even women became part of the bearded axe culture. Smaller versions of the weapon served as both practical tools and status symbols. A woman who could afford a well-made bearded axe was announcing her family's prosperity and her own preparedness to defend her household. Archaeological evidence from across Scandinavia shows these domestic axes in women's graves, alongside jewelry and other precious items. The cultural impact went beyond the practical. Skalds, the poet, historians of Viking society began composing new verses, celebrating what they called the axe dance, the warrior's art that made men move like deadly wind across the battlefield. These weren't just war songs, they were technical manuals disguised as poetry, preserving the fighting techniques and tactical innovations that made the bearded axe so effective. By the end of the 9th century, the bearded axe had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of Viking military superiority, a mark of cultural identity, and a technological advantage that helped sustain Norse expansion across 3 continents. But as we'll see, even the most revolutionary weapons eventually meet their match when the world changes around them once again. By the 11th century after Christ, the bearded axe had reached what weapons historians call its perfect form. This wasn't the crude, experimental design that young Bjorn had hammered out in Ulfbert's forge 2 centuries earlier. No. This was the culmination of 10 generations of smithcraft, battlefield testing, and continuous refinement. The weight had been optimized heavy enough to deliver devastating blows, light enough for the quick, precise movements that made the hook effective. The balance point sat exactly where it needed to be for both chopping and hooking techniques. The steel was of a quality that wouldn't be matched again until the Industrial Revolution. These weapons weren't just tools of war anymore. They were works of art. Silver inlay traced intricate patterns across the blade faces. Runic inscriptions called upon the gods for protection and victory. The handles were carved from carefully selected woods, wrapped in leather that had been blessed by priests and skalds. A master-crafted bearded axe could cost as much as a small farm, and warriors would mortgage their futures to own one. But perfection, as history teaches us, often comes just before obsolescence. The year 1066 Anno Domini would prove to be a watershed moment, not just for the bearded axe, but for the entire Viking way of war. 2 battles fought within weeks of each other would demonstrate both the weapon's ultimate capabilities and the beginning of its decline. The first battle was at Stamford Bridge, in northern England. Harold Hardrada, Harold the Hard Ruler, the last great Viking king, led what would turn out to be the final major Viking invasion of England. Hardrada was already a legend. He'd served in the Varangian Guard, fought in Sicily and the Holy Land, conquered territory from Russia to the Mediterranean. The axe he carried into battle that September morning was itself legendary, a weapon called Emma, its blade inlaid with gold runes that spelled out his victories. The battle itself started as a disaster for the English. Hardrada's Vikings, despite being caught by surprise, managed to form their traditional shield wall and began methodically cutting through the English army. Contemporary chronicles describe the sound thousands of bearded axes striking shields and armour in rhythm, like some enormous, deadly drum that echoed across the Yorkshire countryside. But then came the moment that encapsulated everything the bearded axe represented. When the English army reached Stamford Bridge itself, they found their advance blocked by a single Viking warrior. One man, standing alone on the narrow bridge, wielding a bearded axe that he used with such skill that he created an absolute wall of death. Picture this scene. An entire English army, we're talking about thousands of men, stopped cold by one Viking with an axe. Every time the English tried to cross the bridge, the axeman's hooked blade would catch shields, drag men off balance, and send them tumbling into the river below. Contemporary accounts claim he killed 40 men before an English soldier managed to float downstream in a barrel and thrust a spear up through the bridge planks. That lone axeman's stand represented the absolute pinnacle of personal combat skill that the Viking warrior tradition could produce. But his death also marked the beginning of the end, because the world was changing in ways that made individual heroics less relevant than they'd ever been before. Harold Hardrada himself fell later that same day, struck down not by a worthy opponent in single combat, but by an English arrow fired from long range. Emma, his legendary axe, couldn't defend against an enemy he couldn't reach. This was the new reality. Warfare was becoming less about personal skill and more about technology, tactics, and mass coordination. The second pivotal battle came just 3 weeks later at Hastings, where William the Conqueror's Norman cavalry and crossbowmen faced off against Harold Godwinson's English army. The English actually carried bearded axes into this battle. They'd adopted the weapon from their Viking enemies and made it their own. English huscarls wielding these axes initially devastated the Norman cavalry charges, their hooked blades perfectly designed for dragging mounted warriors from their horses. But the Normans had learned from centuries of fighting against axe-wielding enemies. They used feigned retreats to break up the English shield wall, then employed crossbowmen to strike from distances where axes were useless. Harold Godwinson himself, reportedly, fell to a crossbow bolt to the eye, another case where the finest axe in the world couldn't defend against an enemy beyond its reach. These two battles within a month of each other told the same story. The age of personal combat mastery was giving way to an age of combined arms tactics and ranged weapons. The bearded axe, despite its technical perfection, was becoming obsolete not because it was poorly designed, but because warfare itself was evolving beyond the paradigm that had made it so effective. But here's what's fascinating about military technology. Even in defeat, good innovations don't just disappear. They adapt, they influence, they find new purposes. English huscarls who survived Hastings didn't abandon their axes, they refined them further, developing even more specialized designs for fighting against cavalry. Irish gallowglass warriors, those professional soldiers who would dominate Irish warfare for the next 4 centuries, perfected their own versions of the bearded axe that were optimized for their particular style of combat. Scottish warriors carried bearded axes in battles for centuries to come, finding them particularly effective in the close-quarters fighting that characterized Highland warfare. The weapon had become something more than a tool of war, it had become a symbol. The distinctive hook shape was instantly recognizable as the mark of the Viking warrior tradition. It appeared carved on runestones that commemorated fallen heroes. It was painted on shields and sewn into tapestries. It became part of the visual language that defined Norse culture, even as that culture was being absorbed into the larger medieval world. Archaeological evidence from across northern Europe shows bearded axes being buried with their owners well into the 13th century, long after they'd ceased to be front-line military weapons. These weren't just grave goods, they were statements about identity, heritage, and the warrior values that had shaped an entire civilization. The irony is that the bearded axe achieved its greatest influence precisely as it was losing its military relevance. As we'll see in our final chapter, the principles that made it so effective would echo through centuries of weapons development, influencing designs and tactics in ways that its original creators could never have imagined. The age of the Viking warrior was ending, but the legacy of Viking innovation was just beginning. Here's something remarkable about truly innovative technology. It never really dies. It transforms, it adapts, it influences things in ways that its creators never imagined. The Viking bearded axe, despite becoming militarily obsolete by the 12th century, would continue to shape human civilization for the next 1,000 years, and in some surprising ways, it still does today. Let's start with the most obvious legacy: medieval weapons development. Those weaponsmiths who had studied Viking axes didn't just forget everything they'd learned when cavalry and crossbows changed the battlefield. Instead, they applied the hooking principle to entirely new categories of weapons. The halberd, that fearsome polearm that would dominate European battlefields for centuries, was essentially a bearded axe mounted on a long pole. The bill, the favourite weapon of English infantry, incorporated the same hook and pull mechanics that had made Viking axes so deadly. The glaive, the bardiche, the partisan, all of these medieval polearms traced their conceptual ancestry back to that innovation Bjorn had hammered out in a Norwegian forge. But the influence went far beyond military applications. Ship carpenters across northern Europe had observed how effectively Viking axes could grip and manipulate rope and wood. They began developing specialized tools that incorporated the bearded design for shipbuilding. These weren't weapons, they were precision instruments for shaping the vessels that would carry European explorers to every corner of the globe. When Columbus sailed to the Americas, when Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, when Magellan attempted to circumnavigate the globe, their ships were built using tools that traced their design lineage back to Viking war axes. In Iceland, where trees were scarce and precious, the story took on an almost mythological quality. The axes that settlers brought from the mainland in the 10th and 11th centuries became generational heirlooms, passed from father to son, with genealogies as detailed as any royal sword. These weapons were modified over time to serve as farming tools, building implements, and symbols of family heritage. Icelandic sagas describe axes that had names, histories, and almost personalities of their own. Archaeological excavations in Iceland still turn up these modified bearded axes, some showing evidence of continuous use and maintenance across multiple centuries. The Mammon axe, discovered in a Danish prince's grave in the 1960s, revealed just how far the artistic development of these weapons had progressed. The blade featured silver wire inlay forming the Tree of Life, with Christian and pagan symbols merged in a design that represented the religious transformation of Scandinavia itself. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a masterpiece of medieval metalwork that demonstrated how deeply the bearded axe had become embedded in Norse cultural identity. But perhaps the most surprising legacy comes from the New World. When Norse settlers established their brief foothold in Vinland, what we now call Newfoundland, around 1000 Anno Domini, they encountered Native American peoples who were fascinated by European metal tools. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking axes were traded to indigenous communities, where the bearded design was adapted and incorporated into traditional tomahawk construction. This is where the story becomes truly global. Modified bearded axe designs spread across North America through indigenous trade networks, influencing tool and weapon development among peoples who had never heard of Vikings or Scandinavia. Some of the tomahawks that would later be used against European colonists in the 17th and 18th centuries incorporated design principles that originated in Bjorn's forge 700 years earlier. Meanwhile, back in Europe, military theorists were still studying Viking combat techniques. Swiss mercenaries, those professional soldiers who would dominate European battlefields in the 15th and 16th centuries, analyzed preserved Viking combat manuals and adapted axe techniques for their fearsome halberd formations. The Swiss discovered that many of the hooking and pulling techniques that had made bearded axes so effective translated perfectly to longer polearms used in formation fighting. During the Renaissance, when European scholars began systematic study of military history, Viking weapons became objects of scientific interest. Leonardo da Vinci himself sketched bearded axe designs while working on treatises about leverage and mechanical advantage. He understood instinctively what modern biomechanics would later confirm, that the hook shape multiplied the wielder's effective strength by creating additional vectors of force application. The Industrial Revolution brought new possibilities for studying and reproducing these ancient weapons. 19th-century metallurgists analyzed preserved Viking axes to understand the steelworking techniques that had created them. What they discovered revolutionized their understanding of medieval technology. Viking smiths had been using carbon content manipulation, selective hardening, and stress distribution techniques that weren't officially invented until centuries later. In the 20th century, 2 world wars renewed military interest in close-quarters combat weapons. Special forces units on both sides studied historical fighting techniques, including Viking axework, the British Commandos, the German Fallschirmjäger, and later American Special Forces all incorporated elements of medieval axe techniques into their hand-to-hand combat training. The biomechanical principles that made the bearded axe effective leverage, hooking, and force multiplication proved just as relevant against enemies carrying rifles as they had against mail-clad warriors. Today, in our 21st century world of guided missiles and drone warfare, you might think that Viking axes would be purely historical curiosities, but you'd be wrong. Modern special forces units around the world train with reconstructed Viking weapons as part of their close-quarters combat preparation. Military biomechanics researchers have used high-speed cameras and force sensors to analyze exactly why bearded axes were so effective, confirming through science what ancient warriors had learned through blood and experience. The axes have found unexpected roles in modern contexts. Emergency responders train with bearded axe reproductions because the hooking design is remarkably effective for search and rescue operations in collapsed buildings. The same principles that allowed Viking warriors to hook shields and drag enemies off balance make these tools perfect for moving debris and creating rescue pathways. Museums from Oslo to New York display these weapons not just as artifacts of a bygone age, but as examples of human innovation under pressure. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's Arms and Armor collection includes several bearded axes with interpretive materials that explain their influence on weapons development. The National Museum of Denmark has an entire exhibition dedicated to Viking weapon technology, showing how these tools shaped everything from medieval warfare to modern tool design. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the bearded axe lies in what it represents about human nature itself. Here was a young man, faced with the death of his father and the obsolescence of traditional ways, who chose innovation over resignation. Bjorn could have accepted that the world was changing in ways that made Viking raiders less effective. Instead, he created something new that extended Viking dominance for another 2 centuries. The bearded axe story is ultimately about adaptation, the willingness to take existing technology and reimagine it for new challenges. It's about the relationship between individual creativity and cultural transmission. It's about how military necessity drives civilian innovation. It's about the persistence of good ideas across centuries and continents. From a 9th century Norwegian forge to 21st century special forces training facilities, from Viking longships to Renaissance workshops to modern museums, the influence of Bjorn's innovation continues to ripple through human history. The weapon itself may have become obsolete, but the principles it embodied, innovation, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of effectiveness, remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. That's the real legacy of the Viking bearded axe, not just a weapon that changed warfare, but a testament to the power of human ingenuity to reshape the world, one hammer blow at a time.